Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Anthony Marno. A new analysis shows the impact the oil and gas industry may have on air pollution in New Mexico. Joining us to share more about this new analysis and other environmental concerns is Camilla Feibelman, Sierra Club Rio Grande Chapter Director. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us.
Happy to be here. Just wish it was better news.
Yeah, from what we're seeing with this oil and gas threat map that it is called, what can you share with us about your concerns about how this may be impacting communities in New Mexico?
Sure. Well, first, thanks to a group called Earthworks and their partners, FracTracker, now any person in the entire country can put their address in and see how close to upstream oil and gas facilities they live, whether that's a well or a pipeline or some other sort of facility. And the threat radius is basically a half mile from those facilities. Not that if you live within that radius that you're definitely going to get sick, or if you live a little bit further, you won't. But, a lot of the science that correlates illness with extraction shows that sort of threat radius. And so here in New Mexico, we've seen huge increases in populations living within that threat radius, especially in the Permian Basin because of the oil boom, and up in the northwest part of the state, 80% of the population living within the threat radius, and over half of the Native American population living within that threat radius as well. So this means people where they work, where they live, and where their kids go to school being exposed to all sorts of emissions that have a real impact, especially on respiratory health.
Okay, so according to the data that you all released, there are over 144,300 residents in New Mexico that may be living within this threat zone near oil and gas production facilities. What does the research show us how this can impact health of those residents?
Yeah, it can really vary. It can mean more cases of asthma. It can mean more severe cases of asthma. It can impact birth weights. It can impact the health of expectant mothers. It can lead to certain cancers based on the carcinogenic materials that are emitted from oil and gas facilities. So there are a whole range of impacts that have been well studied and documented in the literature. Now, there are steps that we can take to make these facilities safer, and that has to do with some of the rules that have been recently put in place here in New Mexico, and that we're working to see put in place at the federal level, so that, if you live along the border of Texas and New Mexico, Texas has almost no regulations of some of these emissions. And so even with New Mexico's best rules, you're still at risk. And that's why we're pushing the Environmental Protection Agency to take swift action to protect communities and their residents.
Okay, so the EPA has proposed new standards and safeguards to cut methane. Can you share with us a little bit about what the agency is proposing and what things you think are missing?
Yeah, well, let me take one step back and explain to people a little bit about what comes out of oil and gas facilities. Some of it impacts our water resources, but what we're talking about today is air pollution. And there's a whole array of pollutants that emerge from these facilities. But part of the problem is that they are invisible and odorless. So it can be really difficult to track unless you're using something that Earthworks uses, which are infrared cameras, where you can be looking, let's say, at a compressor station, and it looks like nothing's happening. And you put the infrared camera up and you can just see the pollution spewing out of these facilities. So one part of what comes out is methane, and that's basically a component of natural gas. And it isn't a direct health risk unless you're, breathing it directly, but it's an incredibly potent greenhouse gas that really is driving the heating of our planet and the impacts that we're all seeing. And that's forest fires sweeping the state, extreme drought, climate changes here, and methane is a major part of what's driving that. But there's something called co-pollutants, or things that come out of these facilities along with the methane, which are called ozone precursors. And those combine with sunlight to create that sort of hazy, shimmery look when you put gas in during the daytime. Well, that drives respiratory disease, especially asthma. But there are other carcinogens like benzene, or things that really will harm you within a second. Different chemicals and compounds that we want people not to be exposed to. So what the rules do is they say what industry has to do to protect their neighbors. So that might be regular leak detection and repair, where somebody actually has to go out with one of those infrared cameras and take a look, and then repair those leaks within a certain amount of time. We're also looking to see mechanisms for community reporting of these issues, because here in New Mexico, even with these really excellent rules that have passed over the last year, we don't have agencies that have the budgets to enforce the rules. So by having community members who are equipped and prepared to help, who can then report issues to the agencies, we're likely to see better outcomes for people.
Okay, so with this community reporting, what does your organization envision could help with that to really get this data into the hands of people and in the agencies that really need this information?
Yeah, well, there are groups throughout the state who really focus their attention on this. In the Carlsbad area, Citizens for the Future goes out regularly with Earthworks, with their thermographers, and look for these problems and then report them. And the same thing goes on in the San Juan Basin. You have an issue, especially up there, where sometimes you can have a private landowner who is in charge of the surface. So you might have a rancher. Don Schreiber is someone who talks a lot about this. He's a rancher up in the Aztec area, but he doesn't own the mineral rights underneath. And so companies like Hillcore can come in and extract on his land and really impact his quality of life. Hillcore is one of the leakiest companies in the entire country when it comes to methane and health impacting co-pollutants. And so by having strong rules combined with budgets that are reasonable for these agencies, plus the ability for communities to report and really get some remedies when they do report, our hope is that industry will end up being better neighbors. Now, sometimes they'll say, oh, we do this voluntarily, but it never really turns out to be the case. You go out there with the technology and you see, leaking, venting, flaring going on all throughout, especially the Permian Basin. And so we need strong rules that are well enforced.
So what other suggestions do you have in regards to the EPA's proposed rules that are in effect? What do you think are missing?
Yeah, so one of the big things, and this is where New Mexico has really led under the leadership of the governor and her agencies, and that is to say that even if it's a small well that's not producing that much oil and gas, they still need to do regular leak detection and repair. There were some early proposals at the state level and now at the federal level that somehow these smaller producing wells needed less oversight and inspection. And that's the exact opposite of the case. A lot of times low producing wells are actually very high polluting. So here in New Mexico, the Environmental Improvement Board got rid of those loopholes for smaller producing wells. And we're hoping that the federal government will follow New Mexico's lead and really see that these are nation leading rules and an example to be followed.
Okay, so according to data released by this map that was released with this analysis, New Mexico ranks 8th with the percentage of population who lives near these threatened areas near oil and gas producing facilities. So what can you tell us about the communities that are in these threatened areas?
Yeah, I mean, a couple things to understand about New Mexico compared to most of the other states that have big oil extraction or gas extraction. We don't have a very big population, and we do have a very rural landscape. But once you drill down, so to speak, and look closer at these communities, you really can see the impacts and how they're emerging. So take Eddy County. Since the map was first put out in 2017 and then updated with new census data, we saw an increase in 40% of the population in Eddy County living within a half a mile of an oil or gas facility. And one thing that Kaylee Shoup from Citizens Caring for the Future talks about is that even when a family experiences the health impacts from these facilities, they don't always have the resources to just pick up and move. And I think that that's true in the San Juan Basin as well, especially families who have lived in the area for generations aren't eager to leave, but also are experiencing many of the health impacts that are warned of and flagged in this report. And so it puts people in a really tight spot. You know, if you are the owner of a small daycare or an elementary school that's been there for 30 or 40 years, there are not a lot of options unless the state really regulates and says, you know what, we're going to have setbacks. One organization called NAVA EP, which advocates for Native American communities around the state, worked during our state level rulemaking process to ensure that there were extra protections for communities who do live in proximity of these facilities. And that's something we're really hoping to see as well from the federal government once those rules are finalized.
Well, some of these communities also have housing challenges. It's a boom and bust industry that really drives folks to the area. So how do we know, how can we know that, you know, these are families or businesses, but maybe they may just be makeshift housing put up by the company to get workers in there? Do we know any data on that?
You know, that actually is a really good question. And it's something that a lot of the communities are experiencing, where long-term residents of the communities facing these impacts will say, you know, our quality of life has just plummeted. There are trucks speeding down the roads. There are what are called man camps, where people who kind of come in for temporary labor are housed. You know, you even see some of the collapsing of infrastructure from brine wells, and you know, who's taking responsibility for that. You're seeing rents and housing costs increase. Even the cost of food increases for people during these boom and bust cycles. But another interesting aspect of the boom in the Permian Basin is that, you know, the Permian was actually one of the first basins to recover its production levels post-pandemic, but it never recovered its employment levels. In fact, employment remained 25% down from the employment levels before the pandemic, and that is because of automation. So just like in most manufacturing around the country and in other industries, companies are really driving to automate to save themselves money when it comes to employment. So that's also a very strange dynamic. But I think the most important use of this tool is that people can actually put their own address in and see where they are, decide whether they want to rent there or not, or just understand the reasons for the health impacts that they're facing. Again, I don't want to, you know, sort of draw a direct causal relationship. You know, every person facing health issues has to talk with their own doctor, understand what the background is. But I know that the members of our larger advocacy community who are residing in these areas typically find health impacts related to location, to industry, unfortunately.
I mean, how well do you think healthcare providers are really aware of these impacts in the area? Is this something that your organization is having conversations with providers? I mean, what do we know on this?
Yeah, well, we do have a community of, physicians, nurses, respiratory technicians who get it. They know what their patient community is experiencing, and are helping to communicate that. And I think that that's why it's so important that our agencies truly regulate, so that we're not just allowing these ozone and smog precursors to spew into communities, but that we're doing everything we can to make sure that every child and every family is protected. Because that kid or that adult who ends up in the emergency room because of an asthma attack, that's a lost day at school, that's a lost day at work. That is an economic impact that affects all of us. And so, we do have some work to continue to educate the healthcare community, but they're also on the front lines and they know what their communities are experiencing.
So New Mexico, the United States, the entire world is facing a lot of issues when it comes to a warming climate. Here in New Mexico, we're experiencing a severe drought. We're dealing with wildfires and the impacts that that's having on our state. So what does your organization suggest steps need to be taken to address this issue?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. And I want to just really drive home what is happening in New Mexico. Our, our forests are absolutely dry. In some places, zero humidity. And that is because of global climate change driven by the drought. And that means that even fires, just small fires can plow through huge amounts of forest because there's just no humidity. And so, how do we handle that? You'll hear people say, well, anything I do isn't going to add to the total. And I really want to emphasize that that's not true. The first thing that we can all do is take individual steps. And you might think, well, my little effort to turn off the lights or, keep the temperature lower or higher, depending on the season, don't make a difference. But it does have a viral effect. You installing those panels on your rooftop or buying a used electric vehicle, that is contagious. Your neighbors see that, they add to that. Communities that have one person add solar panels, have a much higher rate of people having solar panels. So I want you to know that the choices that you make are contagious. Other people see that and they follow your lead. And a lot of those technologies are a lot cheaper now. Getting solar panels on your roof is something that can be financed. It saves you money on your monthly bill, and is paid off fairly quickly. There's a whole fleet of used electric vehicles now, and you can combine the charging of your electric vehicle with your solar panels so that you really are reducing your family's impact on climate. But at the same time, we really need industry, corporations, and government to take the lead so that there is that multiplier effect and the changes are real. So here in New Mexico, we passed the Energy Transition Act, and that's going to take on the electric sector. So when you turn the lights on and off in your house, when you run your refrigerator, we now have law that says how much and when larger and larger percentages of renewables have to be online. So we're moving away from coal-fired power, we're moving away from natural gas power towards renewable and battery storage on a very energetic timeline. And so the scale of that impact is huge. We also have worked with the state to pass what are called clean cars rules. And this has been part of the governor's executive order on climate and reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. So it'll mean now that when you, in the next couple of years, walk onto a car lot, you can be assured that there will be electric vehicles there that you can see, that you can test drive, and that you can walk away with. That combined with a whole statewide infrastructure of electric vehicle charging stations so that you can stop off at a restaurant, eat your lunch halfway to where you're going and get charged, is going to mean that people can really use electric vehicles around the state and get tax credits if we can pass the bill next session on that electric vehicle, while there actually already are tax credits at the federal level. So what we're working on doing is looking at each sector in New Mexico and making sure that there are clear rules about how that industry can transition, leading the way for the rest of the country, helping to develop the technology, and ensuring that our state is doing its part to curb global climate change. And then you combine that with the action that other states are taking, that our country is taking, and that the globe is taking. And we hope that we can get where we need to get to really slow down the heating of our planet.
Well, there's a lot of concern right now, especially for folks in the northwestern part of the state, with delays with creating some of these renewable energy farms and plants like the solar farm due to the global supply chain issue. How do you feel that supply chain issues that were really caused by the pandemic and the related issues, how is that impacting the push and transition to more renewable investment?
Yeah, I mean, it is definitely an issue. I will say, though, that the supply chain issues are affecting every sector of our society, from the school uniforms at my kids' school to, baby formula, although that's a bit more complex. So every sector, every form of energy is experiencing some of these issues. There is an added problem for the solar panels in the country right now because of an inquiry from the Department of Commerce looking at the way that panels are produced along its supply chain. We don't think that those issues are valid, and we, along with hundreds of other environmental organizations and manufacturers and installers of solar panels, have called on the Department of Commerce to quickly rule on this so that we can get back to the urgent business of protecting our climate for our kids. And mine's only 5, so we've got a lot of work to do to make sure that by the time he's my age, an age I will not say, the planet is habitable for him and your kids and your grandkids.
Okay, so I mean, we're in an election year, and there's a lot of folks who are running for office right now who are saying we need to invest in climate change and make sure that we address this issue. And then there's a lot of other folks who are saying that we need to take the regulations off the oil and gas industry. The New Mexico Oil and Gas Association said that they provide 134,000 jobs to New Mexicans, many of these jobs making 60 grand or more coming out of high school. A lot of opportunity there for folks who may not want to go to college, and also provides 35% of New Mexico's budget thanks to oil and gas funding due to the revenue taxes that are coming out of that. So I'd like to hear from you. How do you make this push to address these climate goals when the oil and gas industry is contributing so much to the state budget in New Mexico and the economy?
Well, one thing they conveniently forgot to mention is that if you capture all that methane that they're otherwise spewing off into the atmosphere, that's methane or natural gas that they have to pay royalties on that come into our state coffers. So what they're doing right now is extracting natural gas or oil in this state largely off public lands. So that means that the natural resource belongs to you, and it belongs to me and everybody else listening. And the lands that they're extracting it off of and impacting belong to you and me and all your viewers. And so all of that profit that they are reaping is ours. So when they otherwise just spew this stuff, waste it into the atmosphere, and at the same time expose people living nearby to health impacts that cost those people money, lost days at school, lost days at work, we have to ask ourselves, are these good neighbors? Are these people who are responsible enough to operate in our state without regulations? It would be cheaper for me to operate my car if I didn't have to take it for an inspection. But that's not how it works. Every industry, every person in this society contributes in a way that ought to be managed under a certain set of rules that we all agree to.
Okay, now we just have a couple minutes left with you, but I want to ask you about this push to create New Mexico, a hydrogen hub in New Mexico. Your thoughts on this and what folks need to be concerned about?
Hydrogen is a very complex issue, and it's worth understanding that hydrogen, in most cases, in 80% of the cases, just comes from natural gas. You use natural gas to get hydrogen, a molecule, off more natural gas. So until the upstream aspects of natural gas are cleaned up, you can't call hydrogen clean. Now, you can get hydrogen off water, but we don't have much water in the state. And you can power that process with renewables, but we might want to just use those renewables directly. So unless you figure out the end use, the thing you want to use that hydrogen for that can't be done in some other way, then you want to slow down and make sure you actually understand the science. And in most cases, I think folks aren't really clear on what hydrogen is, that it's just another fossil fuel right now, and it's questionable whether we need it at all.
Okay, we just have about 30 seconds left with you, but what would you like some folks to consider with this oil and gas threat map that was recently released?
I think we have a big question to ask ourselves as a society. You know, there are always industries that contribute to our society, but at a certain cost. So what cost are we willing to accept with an industry that operates within our state? Are we willing to accept the health impacts? Are we willing to accept the climate impacts? And are we going to be the innovators that move into a new generation of technology? Kodak was a great camera company, but they didn't get on the digital bandwagon, and now they don't exist. So, oil and gas, what are you going to do to move us into the next generation to ensure that our kids are safe from what you do?
Camilla Feibelman is the Sierra Club Rio Grande Chapter Director. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us.
Thank you.
And we want to thank you for joining us for another episode of Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Anthony Murno. We'll see you next time.